And before we start, I want to talk about a little bit of the Historic Districts Council for those who are not familiar with it. The Historic Districts Council is an organization that works across New York City, and we help communities preserve the architectural characters of their neighborhoods, the history and the treasures of their neighborhoods. And this is an initiative that we're carrying out in the Bronx, where we want to partner with community members and highlight the treasures of this borough. And we do walking tours, we do virtual talks, we do all kinds of events that help us advance the preservation of all historic buildings and districts across the city. And before we start with Sherida, I want to talk about one of our main events that is going to take place in November, at the end of November. We're having our Lion event, which is going to be in November 29th. And this year, we're going to honor Darren Walker, who is the president of the Ford Foundation. The Lion Award is an award that we give to people who have been involved in preservation, who have helped in this field and have contributed significantly to this field. So this is going to be an in-person event, and it's going to be on November 29th. If you want to know more about it, please go to hdc.org and you'll find more information there. So with that, I want to welcome Sherida. Thank you so much for joining us, Sherida.
Thank you for inviting me. This is wonderful, and it's nice to be able to talk about the Bronx and a very special neighborhood and historic district. And I guess I've gotten in the chat a few notes here that there are people who grew up in Fieldston who are tuning in, which is very nice. And I want to also just give a shout out to Diego, who has been doing a really marvelous job cultivating historic district interest and preservation interest in the Bronx. He started, I guess, about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. And he's built up a following, which is really great, because I was telling him beforehand that 20 years ago, the Historic Districts Council came to me when I had moved to the Bronx and said, well, where are the preservationists? And I said, you know, people here are more interested in trees sometimes, which enhances the historic districts. So I'll start in. First of all, a little bit more about me, and especially Riverdale and the Fieldston Historic District. Since I left Landmarks, I'm an architect, and this is my office on 9th Avenue in the Film Center building with a historic designated lobby, which is quite fabulous. And I have, since I left the commission, been the chapter president of the AIA New York. And I currently chair the Riverdale Nature Preservancy, which advocates for better land use through zoning and environmental causes and nature preservation, along with buildings. So we're very active in the neighborhood, and Fieldston was one of our key interests. So just to orient everybody to where this all is. And this is actually very important, this first slide, which says Fieldston Private Community. One of the great advantages Fieldston has to preserving community character is that they are private, they own their streets. And they do close their streets once a year to preserve that private quality, which allows them to control everything in terms of their neighborhood environment. So we all know where the Bronx is, here at the northern end of the city. Manhattan over here, and Queens over here, with Brooklyn way down here. A very important feature of Riverdale is the Hudson River, which is this white area on the side. And Riverdale is roughly where my cursor is right now, if you can see that. And this is the historic district map from Landmarks. And this very heavily drawn line of boundary was very carefully considered because it represents the line of what was Delafield Estates that became the Fieldston neighborhood. And what I want to point out is West 246th Street, which my cursor is following along, which goes down to Broadway down here. And this little pond over here called Indian Pond. And you can note that the street pattern is very windy and curvilinear. It's not the city grid, and you'll see that all over the place. Riverdale in general is the land of privately owned public rights of way. We have mapped streets, but almost all of this is privately owned. So they're narrow streets, there are no sidewalks, there's a lot of trees. And I wanted to go back. This is 1873 topography map. And I want you to see that there's this sort of oval piece here. This brown line represents what is now the Henry Hudson Parkway and Riverdale Avenue. They parallel each other. And this area is Fieldston. And if you see this little bitty body of water, that's Indian Pond. So these natural features and the topography of this area were very key to developing the design of Fieldston. And the map on the left is one of the early Fieldston maps, 1912. And what happened was the subway system came all the way up to 242nd Street down here. This is Van Cortlandt Park on this side where my cursor is. Broadway coming along. There's a trolley line which went up to Yonkers. So north is to the right on this plan. But you'll see here's West 246th Street, pretty much following the path of what was called Delafield Road. And these other streets are following topographical levels. This zone here, which is labeled Teachers College, was sold to Teachers College at Columbia University. They never occupied it. They moved their school, which is the Horace Mann School, up to this area. And that's where the Horace Mann School is today. The rest of the site was broken up into little lots, but they required people to buy 3 lots at a minimum in order to begin development in this area. And the other interesting 1912 map, so this is all when Fieldston was starting, is a map showing the location of Delafield Estate in New York City. And A is Delafield Estate. So it went from Riverdale Avenue, where the Henry Hudson Parkway is now, all the way down just almost to Broadway. And this oval, which was the oval on the topographic map, and a little bit north over here. The rest of this part of Riverdale was mostly large estates. And the original Riverdale Historic District, which you'll see the boundaries of in a minute, was designated around the core group of what were mansion buildings. And Wave Hill, What are some of the day schools now? There's a number of important mansion buildings on the west side of the Henry Hudson Parkway. Here we're east of the Henry Hudson Parkway. But taking a step back, preservation isn't the only tool that we have in our toolbox to maintaining neighborhood character and really developing something that's quite special. And what Fieldston accomplished in 1938, when apartment buildings were proposed to be built in the core area, was single-family, no apartment building zoning. And it was not to keep people out, it was to keep the natural environment and the scale of the area quite cohesive. And one of the things that is important to know about Riverdale is that there are a number of things that people have done over the years. The sewers are private, so it's very hard to overdevelop anything because the private sewer system can only handle so much. We have the privately owned streets on both sides of the Henry Hudson Parkway, and we have a lot of rock. We have rock outcroppings all over the place. So the first tool that was employed in preserving Fieldston specifically was coming up with single-family zoning in that core area. The second thing that happened in the 1970s was the Special Natural Area District. And there are very large natural area districts on Staten Island and Fort Totten in Queens. The Bronx has this small natural area district, which is, the boundary is shown in this dashed red line. There's a hole right here. This is Fieldston, and this is the Riverdale Historic District. And most of this special natural area district is zoned primarily for single family houses. And that is because of topography. This is a ridge, and things fall down, and they fall way down to get to the Hudson River. This is rather hilly in this zone, and you can see in the gray where the topography is going all over the place. And in the green over here, you can see Van Cortlandt Park. I don't know how many of you are aware of the Parks Department's master plan for Van Cortlandt Park, which includes daylighting brooks, that bodies of water that have been buried over the years, but those streams run across and go into the Hudson River along some of these dips and valleys. So it's an interesting environment. So as you can see, the Riverdale Historic District was designated in 1990. Toward the end of the 90s, the Community Board 8, which includes a much larger area here, and the Riverdale Nature Preservancy, which I currently chair, decided that we needed a community-based master plan, or a 197A plan. And as part of that plan, they called for making Fieldston a historic district. That was not something that everybody wanted. People don't like being told what to do with their houses. But the feeling was that they really wanted to confirm the development patterns that had been promised to this neighborhood back in the 1950s. So what they had agreed to do was allow apartment buildings along the ridge, the high point, and then keep the downslopes basically lower with smaller developments. There are small apartment buildings, and there are the single family houses. And these slides are courtesy of the Department of City Planning. And then just some quick numbers. This is, again, the Special Natural Area District boundary. There's a total of roughly 800 plus or minus lots within the Special Natural Area District. Fieldston itself is a little over 250. So it comprises a very large portion of the Special Natural Area District. And you can see that we in Riverdale are blessed with a lot of lovely parks. We've got Riverdale Park over here, which is a forever wild. It's a really wonderful place to go for a walk. This one is mapped as parkland, but that's Wave Hill, so it's a cultural center as well. And we've got Van Cortlandt Park, and we've got water all over the place, which is great. We also have train tracks along this edge. And then we have along Broadway, the subway, which comes roughly to here. So that's a lot of planning and other stuff, but it's important to understand that Fieldston, which was conceived in the early 20th century, 1910, and developed through the 1920s into the 40s, it really was based on preserving nature and having a special kind of character. And that was related to the environment. And that has been extended up and down. So the other thing that's interesting about Fieldston is the quality of the houses. They had a design review committee. They had only 8 architects who were allowed to work in Fieldston for the Delafields. And so the first house I wanted to highlight was 355 West 246th Street. This is a 1911, so this is one of the earliest houses in the district. And this house was designed for one of the Delafields. So it was considered, and it was very obviously Tudorish, not by the preeminent architect, Dwight Jamesbaum, but something that was very well received. And then 5020 Goodridge Avenue. And what you're starting to see is how much landscape there is around these houses. And you can see stairs. They're not the most accessible houses in the world. But there is a lot of topography. You can see this street over here is at a higher elevation and this is going down, but there's a tremendous effort to maintain green space, to preserve trees. These are not some of the oldest trees, obviously, but there's always, especially with the natural area district requirements, there's an effort to have more trees. So this house is 1914, 1915. So they were just getting rolling with building these houses. This one's 1915. And this one, let me double check. Yeah, this is one of the early ones. And this had some minor additions, historic additions, to develop some of these additional dormers on this house. It's, I don't quite know what you would call the style necessarily, but it's fun. This is a Dwight Jamesbaum house, and his buildings are interesting because they have a very refined scale, and he uses his architectural vocabulary, these sort of Doric columns, along with a more tapered country, smaller version of it, but he frames the main portion of the building quite handsomely, uses dormers in interesting ways, innies and outies, and you'll see the stone. One of the notable things about Fieldston is Fieldstone is everywhere. It's on the buildings, it's on, if you have an original sidewalk, and not everybody does, there's a lot of tripping hazards with some of the sidewalks, but they're quite beautiful. And this is, I believe, another Dwight Jamesbaum. Yeah. And this one I pass anytime I'm going right through because it's right on the corner of West 246th Street, which is a gateway into the district, and Fieldston Road, which is the main spine of the district. It's the wide boulevard type street. But you can again see breaking down the scale, the use of the materials, that again, playing with the stone. So it's very cohesive, but not stylistically all one thing. It's very mixed. Something that's much more restrained. This is later, 1929. So in the 1920s, the Delafields, there were not many Delafields still living in the Riverdale area. And the heirs decided that this was not giving them a very good return on their investment. So they decided they were going to just get rid of it. And the Fieldston property owners formed Fieldston Inc. and the Fieldston Property Owners Association, and they raised the money to buy the unbuilt lots from the Delafields so that they could continue to have it develop as a cohesive single-family neighborhood with preservation of the trees, a lot of landscaping, and this restrained group of architects who were allowed to design things here. The property owners had their own design review committee well into the 30s and 40s. And that's, this is one of the later buildings from that period. So, so as I was starting to say, the design review committee was pretty insistent on approving designs that they felt were cohesive and compatible, but not stylistically all the same. And they then, I guess, felt like this was hampering their ability to become modernists. And I think it also was a way to help them sell more of the remaining lots. And so they dropped the design review committee and they started letting people build contemporary houses. So this is from the early 1960s. And there were a number of local Bronx architects who were designing these more modern houses. But again, they don't have flat roofs for the most part. They've got a little bit of a slope. They use shingles to keep in a more craftsman kind of style. The thing that's interesting is that you start to see the garage doors becoming very prominent on the streets, where previously you got a house like this where you had a lot of steps to get up to the house. And so it's a different approach, but they didn't get rid of the trees. And this is another contemporary house. From this angle, it looks almost traditional, but you can see that there's a very vertical slot, larger expanses of glass, flat panels, but it's interspersed with the shingles. And then we get this one. So this is the early 1990s. So again, we've got, sort of special natural area district regulations that are codifying preservation of the landscape. We've got, so we've got zoning, and we've got community interest in at least keeping the environment somewhat consistent. And then this starts in the 90s, where people take some of the more traditional houses and redo them. And this, people were concerned. And this is, I think, when the start of a move toward designating this district as a district started percolating in people's minds. So this is early 1990s. 1997 to 2000, they start doing preservation research. I did the first community outreach meeting in probably 2002. And that at that point, people were most concerned about whether they would have to restore their slate roofs, because that's a very costly concern, and what kinds of windows they would be able to deal with. And so the request was, look at this as not just a historic district designating, but how would you do a master plan to guide owners in what to do with their properties. And the district took another 6 years to make it over the finish line and get designated. But one of the benefits of that is this lovely house. This house did not have this addition at all when it was designated as part of the district. This was added very sensitively and very beautifully to keep it behind the primary facade of the house, use similar materials, maintain the colors, and then do this quirky little connector piece, which is quite charming. Doesn't really flow with the rest of it, but the design is something that is friendly and compatible with the rest of the district. And this particular house is up on one of the ridges just off the highway. And I think those are all the pretty pictures that I have. And I thought you guys might have interesting questions. Diego, is that allowed?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for this interesting presentation. If anyone has a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. I do see that someone
There's some chats
typed on the chat a few questions.
Okay, there's
Grover, he asked if there were demographic restrictions back then.
I don't believe so. I think that this neighborhood, it's very interesting. This neighborhood was not just a white Anglo-Saxon population. It was settled basically by a lot of people of other religions. And even though Riverdale itself is known for Presbyterian and Episcopalian churches, which are landmarks and quite beautiful by Renwick, this neighborhood was a mix of Jews, Christians, and today has become very popular with more observant Jewish families because the houses are sizable enough and beautiful enough that it's become very attractive to this population. But there are Middle Eastern countries that own some of the bigger houses as their consular settings. So it's been a mix, and it seems to be that it was really about having people who wanted to live in this kind of environment. And that has been a theme in Riverdale for at least since the 1950s, when they started really pursuing how to maintain the character of the area.
Okay.
And that's got a lot to do with the way that Riverdale has developed over the years. And the community board, because the demographic question is an interesting one. The community board encompasses public housing, some of the early co-op buildings around Van Cortlandt Park. It has these very lovely mansion buildings, but it also has a lot of small single-family homes that would not be affordable in Manhattan or Brooklyn these days. It's like this wonderful secret. There's a lot of city employees who live in these buildings in this neighborhood. So it's interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm curious to know more about the differences and similarities between Fieldston and Riverdale, because they're very close to each other? And are they similar in terms of architecture?
They are similar. Well, Fieldston is actually in Riverdale. This is what, that's what's kind of interesting about it. Riverdale is just the whole neighborhood, basically along the Henry Hudson Parkway. And there's Riverdale Avenue, which parallels the Henry Hudson Parkway and then goes north into Yonkers. And then there's Fieldston Road, which is the main drag through Fieldston itself. The mansion houses, which are on the west of the Henry Hudson Parkway, closer to the Hudson River, those were developed as country houses for financial gurus and poobahs. In Lower Manhattan, they had their own docks. They had their own train stop. They had Delafield himself, when he bought this tract of land, it's a big tract of land, in 1829, he bought it because there was the potential for a lime kiln, which they wanted. And so we had a brick making facility. We had a lot of interesting industrial, but not too close to the mansion buildings, kinds of uses along the river. And that's what's really interesting if you get into Riverdale Park. Along the river is you come across these vestiges of some of those older semi-industrial kinds of uses.
All right. And I'm curious to know why, compared to Riverdale, to the Riverdale Historic District, why did it take so long for Fieldston to become a historic district? Because they seem very similar in terms of architecture, history, but compared to the Riverdale Historic District, Fieldston took much longer.
I'll use a parallel. You've heard of Carnegie Hill. The original historic districts in Carnegie Hill were two teeny tiny rows of row houses, very pretty row houses and very nice ones. And then a few individual landmarks, which were mansion buildings. That character was threatened by development along Madison Avenue in the 90s. Not the years 90s, but in the streets 90s, when you got those two very tall towers that went up. And the Friends of the Upper East Side and Carnegie Hill neighbors turned to massive advocacy to get a Carnegie Hill historic district. Numbers, political advocacy, all of that mattered. It was easy to do the Riverdale Historic District because it was small. It was not a lot of houses, and they were houses that were owned by people who were very supportive of designation. Fieldston is over 250 houses, and it's not easy to get 250 people to all agree that they want the city to take oversight over what they do on their houses. So it took longer, but I think development pressures and the desire to really maintain the character of the neighborhood, which was a theme that has always been in Fieldston, was what carried it over the finish line to get designation. And it's not easy.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm seeing some really interesting questions here. Is there a commercial district? Not in Fieldston itself. Fieldston does not allow any commercial activity within the district boundaries. And that was the way it was designed. There are commercial districts within 5 minutes walk just outside the district. And one of the comments here about ethical culture and Fieldston School, there are 3 private schools, really great private schools, Horace Mann, Riverdale Country, and Fieldston. They're all outside the historic district. They're their trustees and their administration all lobbied very hard to keep out of the district, but they're all subject to the special natural area district regulations. So they still have to go to city planning when they want to do anything. And the same people who worry about Fieldston are the same people who worry about what the institutions are doing in Riverdale. So most of their buildings have been, more recent buildings have been somewhat more contextual and using materials that are common. It wasn't a marble quarry. It was really brick kilns and lime kilns. So these were smokier kinds of oven structures. And there were greenhouses that were also both for the mansions, but also somewhat commercial.
Okay. And someone just sent me question. Given climate change and flooding issues, could you talk about waterways? Historically, how did early owners and builders in Fieldston work with water flow in their architectural design and consideration?
Yeah, that is a really excellent question. And that goes back to probably the 1880s. The Delafields started out by calling Frederick Law Olmsted to come and advise them about what to do with all of this land. And it's one of the reasons that Riverdale does not have a grid. The streets very much follow topography and waterways, and that's one of the things that we fight very hard to maintain. What we've seen, though, in the last 20 years, 30 years, is that even though there's not a ton of development, the expansion of houses can divert water in ways that is not the best. And that's one of the reasons that we fight very hard to keep our special natural area district regulations, because those are really about preserving the rock outcroppings, which help to drive water in certain ways, maintaining trees or planting more trees if your expansion of your building requires something to take up some of the lot coverage, and ground cover. There are native plant species that are advocated for in this. So the natural part of this is really, really important. And the issues, the flooding issues that we've had, especially in the last two storms this summer, came about because DOT tried to do some sidewalk enhancements and they put the drainage in the wrong place. So we've had some buildings get flooding, but not within Fieldston itself. Fieldston is pretty friendly for water runoff. And if we can get more of the stream corridors that do exist and run down to the Hudson River managed a little better, that's in the works.
Okay, someone's asking if you could tell us more about the Indian Pond.
Indian Pond was a point of controversy about, I'd say 6 or 7 years ago. There is a very large property that fronts on, let me see if I can go back. Apologize for flipping, but I think, okay. Let's close that. So here's Indian Pond. Here's Fieldston Road. And if you'll see my cursor kind of wrapping around this very big house on this very big lot, and there's a very big rock outcropping right off the corner there. So there was a proposal by the owners of the property to subdivide the property and to build. Initially, they proposed 4 more houses and they took it down to, I think, 3 houses at some point. But there was a ton of concern in the neighborhood because adding that much building to what was a big lot, but a rocky lot, had everybody worried that the pond would be degraded. And it is, it's a bird sanctuary in many ways, and it is a very important water feature. And one of the reasons to pull the topography map up from 1873 was to show that water was a natural feature. That was not something created as part of somebody's design idea for this naturalistic planning. And it was considered a community resource. It's not privately owned by any of those lots around it. So it's been preserved.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it was a very interesting discussion at the commission because the placement of this very big house well away from the street and the fact that it's fairly intact and its lot is intact led to a very interesting discussion, because while some of the lots have been carved up and there are some houses that are really cheek by jowl close to each other, this section is much broader and more open, and it was more appropriate to reduce whatever development might happen there. Mm-hmm. And then having a water feature back there that was enjoyed by the entire community was, you didn't want to clog up that water.
Yeah. So I don't see more questions on the chat, but I would like to ask one final question. So you were involved in the process of designating Fieldston as a historic district from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. And as I was telling you before this conversation, HDC is working on bringing attention to Parkchester in the Bronx.
Yes.
I think it would be wonderful to have a Parkchester historic district. So I was wondering if you could tell us some, ideas, suggestions, tips on strategies on how to do this process and how to bring attention to an area like Parkchester and ultimately turn it into a historic district.
Well, there's a number of paths that, in my experience, are very important to designation. The first one is having at least some research that aids you in telling a story. And telling a story about a historic district is important because we're talking about history, not just architecture, in coming up with these things. And Parkchester has a great story. It's not just beautiful buildings. It's middle-class housing that was developed, same as Stuyvesant, and it has incredible artistic elements. It has these beautiful sculptural pieces on the corners of the buildings that are just marvelous. And it's a wonderful, walkable area. It's beautiful. And so the first thing is knowing what you've got and being able to tell somebody what it is you've got. The second thing is it's good to have local people who are invested and interested in having this kind of amenity. I mean, we know that designation enhances property values. I know some people say it gentrifies, but in other situations, it's not so much gentrification as just saving the buildings from falling down. And that's one of the other things. If the New York City bar for designation is too high, getting listed on the National Register is very important because it brings with it tax benefits that allow for the larger scale owners, if it's a management company or something, to benefit from the listing of a property on the National Register. And once it's on the National Register, it becomes part of the story and part of the research that you can then present to the Landmarks Commission. So having local voices, having information, And last, but most important, you need the politicians on your side, because at the end of the day, this gets voted on by the Landmarks Commission, but City Council gets to say yay or nay. And they take that role very seriously. And there is one building in Queens that got designated 3 times and turned back 3 times. And the commission finally got it, the Jamaica Savings Bank. It's a tiny building, very beautiful. But the city council members, and they told me why, it had to do with who owned the building, and they didn't want to benefit them. So it kept getting turned around. But it is very important to have outreach to the electeds and the appointed officials. And it doesn't mean just going to the borough president. It's up and down the whole thing. You need your community board support. You need your council members' support. It's never a bad idea to get your state assembly or state senator representatives also on boards, saying what they think would help. These are the kinds of things that help in getting things pushed across the finish line. And then you've got to make sure that city planning doesn't come along and change something. We all worry about city planning. I see some smiles.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sherida. This
You're very
conversation
welcome.
was very, very informative and very entertaining. As I said in the beginning, this is such an interesting historic district, Fieldston, that not too many people know about. And what we're doing at the Historic Districts Council is to highlight all parts of the Bronx through our Bronx Borough Landmarks Committee. So we've had speakers from all over the borough, from Longwood, from Parkchester, from Mott Haven, from Hunts Point. And this is the first time we have someone from the west side of the borough. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. There's way more to see too.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And as I said, this is part of our Bronx Borough Landmarks Committee. And with us is the chair of this borough committee, Sam Brooks. He's a friend of the Historic Districts Council. And he's been leading this initiative of highlighting places, inviting people, speakers. So Sam, if you would like to say a few words about the Bronx Borough Landmarks Committee and what
thank you, Diego, and Sherida, thank you very, very much. It was a very impressive presentation. Just Sunday, I was in Riverdale, sitting down and watching some football games there. So I had a great time in the neighborhood. But as Diego mentioned, the Bronx Borough Landmarks Committee, believe it or not, I'm now beginning to get that feeling and that sense that steam is being picked up. And I think a lot of people now are beginning to recognize the darlings that we have here in the South Bronx. I hail from Mott Haven, here on 140th, Mott Haven East Historic District. And I think these monthly conversations that we have with the council, with HTC, and the rest of our friends from the Bronx, by virtue of the fact that you live in the Bronx, by definition, you are also part of the Bronx Borough Landmarks Committee. And Diego has done a wonderful job putting it all together. And of course, we had the backing of the Historic District Council. And just as a matter of record, today's event was one of the highest participations that we've had. Just goes to show you the interest that many of the people on this Zoom call had about and have and continue to have about the Bronx. So I thank you so much for taking your time and blessing us with some of your expertise in terms of Fieldston and Riverdale.
Well, thank you, Sam.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sherida. Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you so much, everyone who attended. As I said, I'm going to post this conversation on YouTube, so make sure to check our YouTube channel, HTC's YouTube channel, and also make sure to check our programs, our upcoming walking tours. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.